Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Dina Moyal, and I would like to open our next panel, which is entitled Challenging Democratic Regimes, Contemporary Perspectives. I want to welcome all of you here at Tau, and also our speakers on Zoom. We have two speakers on Zoom, Behrends and Veljko Vujačić. And we have a third speaker from Tau who is in these moments finishing his class in the next building, so he will be here shortly. This is why we're going to start with our speakers on Zoom. And in a sense, our panel is following certain questions which were already brought up yesterday at the keynote and today about the ways majorities use their power in order to force certain conditions on minorities, but also I think it ties in very well with certain remarks, the opening remarks of Ariel David yesterday, who reminded us about 1989 and how this moment when the Berlin Wall fell, we were all feeling joyous about the victory of democracy. Europe was turning democratic, and it was also part of this notion of modernity in the West, that yes, once a country crosses the border to democracy, it cannot go back. Well, we heard a lecture about the Arab Spring. This was a very short-living experiment in democracy, but today we're going to discuss this question of democracy today, and 30 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we see democracy fighting different challenges from inside, from the outside, and we're going to explore in this panel some examples of what is going on in Russia, Eastern Europe, and from Yoav in the United States today, which is considered all the times the model of democracy. So I welcome you again, and I'll introduce our speakers one by one. Each one of them has about 20 minutes, and then we'll open the floor for questions. So our first speaker is Behrends. He's a research associate at the Leibniz Center for Contemporary History in Potsdam, and a professor of history at European University Viadrina, Frankfurt on Oder. His studies explored different aspects of the Soviet and post-Soviet regimes and the transition from one regime to the other. His research topics range from the nature of Stalinism and the use of propaganda to the role of violence and war in shaping those regimes, as well as everyday experiences in dictatorship. And as a researcher at ZZF, he headed different projects, one of them violence in late socialism, and since 2019, legacies of communism, post-communist Europe, from stagnation to reform, and between autocracy and revolution. And he has authored and edited many books. I'll just throw in a few titles: Propaganda for Soviet Union in Poland and East Germany, The Leader Cult in Communist Dictatorships, Stalin and the Eastern Bloc, and the Post-Soviet Experience. So I hope that with Behrends' lecture, we'll be able to have a glimpse, at least, some explanation or thoughts about what is going on with democracy today, or with the attempts at democracy. So Jan, please.
Yeah, hello from Berlin, and thank you very much, first of all, for having me. And I have to start by apologizing that I, couldn't come to Tel Aviv. I would have loved to come, but it's difficult for us because we have no official permit to travel either to Israel or Ukraine, which makes it difficult to come during the semester, because we have to take basically vacation to go to Israel or go to Ukraine, which makes it very difficult to do research and meet colleagues. But that is not my responsibility, but the responsibility of the university and the institute directors. So again, apologies. I would have come, but for these bureaucratic reasons, it's not possible. And so I'm talking to you from my living room in Berlin, basically. And actually, Dina, I will not talk that much about democracy, but rather the failure of democracy and the re-establishment of dictatorship. Because in this paper, where I'm presenting the English version here. I've already published this in German in a journal. I argue that we can once again use Hannah Arendt and her study of totalitarian rule to learn more about Putin's Russia. So that's basically my point. Now I won't go into the whole Hannah Arendt argument today because it will be too long and have too many quotes and be a little bit too complicated. So what I want to do here is rather present my arguments about the nature of rule in Putin's Russia, which I see in a process of radicalization since 2011. And since I'm a historian, I will make also the historical argument that, and there we have an overlap with the discussion about 1989, which you obviously had yesterday, that I argue for the first time basically in history, Russia is a country that goes from total rule through a period of liberalization, of authoritarian rule, back to something very close to totalitarianism, because I think that Russia, or Putin's Russia, since 2022 is sort of like on the trajectory to become something like Iran or North Korea. It's not there yet, still some distance to cover. But I think if we're honest, we have to see that this is the direction where Russia is moving. And I think as historians, we need to explain this by going back partially to Stalinism, but also to late socialism, where Putin and his entourage were socialized. And also by looking at the 1990s, I argue in my work that the 1990s are a very crucial decade for understanding these regimes, also for understanding, for example, the differences between Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine has a lot of flaws in its democracy. We know that, and corruption and so on. But Ukraine did have competitive elections in the 1990s, and Russia did not have competitive elections. And if we talk about democracy, I think the lowest standard of having democracy is that you can vote someone out of office, and you could vote a Kravchuk out of office, but you could not vote Yeltsin out of office. So many things already happened in the 1990s that lead us to Putin and his rather totalitarian traits that we can observe today. Nevertheless, I also want to emphasize that Putin, of course, is not Stalin. He's not a Georgian revolutionary. He has no messianic ideology, and also his brutality, although he uses terror and war in his aggression against Ukraine, is of course not on the same level as Lenin or Stalin or Hitler or Mao. At the same time, we have to understand that Putin is an admirer of Stalin, and that very, very openly so. I remember from my time in Poland that I read in the memoirs of the Polish president Aleksander Kwaśniewski that very soon after Putin took office in 1999, 2000, Kwaśniewski visited him, and this is way before the war and so on, and asked Putin, what are actually your role models? What are you striving for? And to Kwaśniewski's horror, Putin replied, my role models are Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, and Josef Vissarionovich, which of course means Stalin, and this left Kwaśniewski quite terrified. But it also shows that Putin himself places himself into this continuity of imperialism and tyranny, if you want. So, and well, we can go into more details in the discussion. Of course, the Putin regime ideologically is a mixture of different traits of Russian imperialism dating back to the 18th and 19th century, of the legacy of late socialism, and also of post-Soviet transformations. So how did Putin's rule develop, and how do I, construct my argument historically? I argue basically that Putin wanted to build something new, especially during his first 2 terms in power. And when this new regime failed, he went back to the old Soviet models. Now, of course, Putin only came there because of developments in the 1990s, or so to say, it was the 1990s that made Putin possible, and someone like Putin, someone with a KGB background, could only be chosen because Russia already went back to the path of authoritarianism under Yeltsin. So it's not only Putin who transformed Russia in the direction of authoritarianism, but it's also decisions that were made when Putin was far away from power. And I think the most important year that we have to talk about here would be the year 1993, because the year 1993 already showed that Russia was on a different path than, let's say, East Central Europe, East Germany, or other, post-communist states. Because in this year, when there was the power struggle between Yeltsin, so to say, the presidency, and the parliament, the Supreme Soviet, this was not solved by, going to a round table, which was sort of like the Polish model that was introduced in 1989 to peacefully cope with these sorts of problems. But the power struggle, as we all know, or the older ones of us remember, was resolved by tanks in the very center of Moscow that bombarded the parliament building, something that would have been unthinkable even under Brezhnev or Gorbachev, I would argue, very massive military violence. And this showed that the period of liberalization and of perestroika initiated by Gorbachev in 1985 was basically already over in 1993, and that this authoritarian path was taken. This was further exemplified, of course, by the first Chechen War, which was the first attempt at mass killing Russian citizens since Stalin. We have to remember that the Chechens were also citizens of the Russian Federation, and we have all sorts of basically genocidal war crimes in Chechnya already during the 1990s. And this is something, these 2 developments are basically inherited by Putin when he comes to power. Still, I would argue that it was not Putin's original intention to build a full-scale dictatorship, but it was also not his intention to build democracy. What he intended to do, I think, in the first 8 years in power, was a regime based on a combination of personal popularity, economic prosperity, authoritarian modernization, and a consistent manipulation of the public through mass media. This means he did not aim initially to for a complete domination of Russian society, but he settled for something like the petrification of politics. His aim was control, but not yet subjugation. And the construction, or the attempt to construct such a new type of authoritarian state, basically lasted until 2011, when we see the mass protests in Moscow. And there, the regime in Russia returns openly to the methods that it had learned in the Soviet Union. And these are, of course, lies, fear, violence, terror, and war. Of course, this is a gradual process. It doesn't happen on one day. But I think the whole idea that one can build this softer authoritarian state basically collapses with the protests of 2011. And after that, we see an acceleration of the re-Sovietization. Now, why is this re-Sovietization possible at all? And I think here we have to go back again in history and understand what the Soviet state looks like, because it looks much different, of course, from a Western state. It is a state that is built to dominate, and not a state that was built to protect the people, which is, of course, usually the idea of the state in Western societies. And Russia never became such a state. Lenin built his dictatorship basically on three large pillars. The first one was the party. The second one was the secret police. And the third pillar of the Leninist state was, of course, the army, an army that could also always be used inside for suppression inside. Now, if we look at Gorbachev's reforms, and my country, of course, in Germany, Gorbachev is very popular because of reunification. But if we look at Gorbachev's reforms, then two of these pillars remain basically and survive perestroika relatively unscathed. Gorbachev gets rid of the Communist Party, but he does not get rid of the KGB, of the secret police and its structures, and he does not reform the army. The army goes out of Eastern Europe, and it has a smaller area that it dominates, but it remains the same army that is, so to say, very much shaped by the Soviet legacy and by the totalitarian experience. It is not reformed and turned into any sort of thing like resembling like a Western army, and we see that in the Chechen War and all the brutality, and in the brutality also with which this army treats its own soldiers. Now, why is this important for Putin? Because Putin basically inherits, this is what I called in my essay, the two of the totalitarian cores, these core totalitarian institutions still functioning, the secret police and the army. And what he has to do is, of course, to revive them and to give them permission to go, back to their Soviet methods and to their modus operandi from the Stalinist time. And that's what we can see, of course, in the secret police that goes back to, murdering people at home and abroad, all the murders in Berlin, in London, in other places. This is, of course, straight out of the Soviet playbook. And all of this is possible because these, what I call totalitarian cores, are never reformed. In Chechnya, of course, Putin is able to create a space where he can, in the Second Chechen War that he starts in 1999, where he can sort of like have a laboratory of terror. All the terror that we later see in the Donbass are nowadays, after 2022, after the full-scale invasion in the occupied territories in Ukraine, all of this was already there in the Second Chechen War, the deportations, the holding of hostages, the random shootings of civilian population. All of this is not new in the Ukrainian conflict, but it is, again, something that was inherited in the Second Chechen War. Now, we talked about the institutions and Putin's personal rule. I think if we look at Putin, then again, it can be good to compare him a bit with the Stalin of the 1920s, because both Stalin and Putin managed in the end to build a personal dictatorship within an authoritarian state, right? So Stalin, he inherits the communist dictatorship, but within this communist dictatorship that continues to exist, he builds his personal dictatorship. And I think the same thing we can also observe with Putin nowadays. Putin is no longer just the head of the authoritarian structures of what you'd like to call the power vertical when he came to power, but he is now a personal dictator, like Stalin. And in a way, if you argue with Hannah Arendt, then you can see that the state structures under Putin become less and less relevant, and it has become more and more about personal networks. The personal relationship of people to Putin is much more important than whether they are on the top of the foreign ministry or the Security Council or so on. All of these institutions have somewhat lost their meaning when it comes to power, and it's much more important to be close to the leader. Now, on a cultural level, just to round this up, we can see that that there's a full embrace of Soviet history again. Of course, this started already when Putin reintroduced the Soviet anthem and so on very early in his reign. But by now, you know, the cult of the victory of 1945, the cult of war, but also the cult of Stalin have been reintroduced, and so this is also symbolically going back to the days of the Soviet Union. While if you look at the way the public is dealt with, the public sphere, we see, you know, the moving away a bit of these narratives of dramaturgia that we had in the early Putin phase, to very aggressive propaganda, basically threatening people with violence. And again, Hannah Arendt argued that at the very core of totalitarian rule, there's always the lager, the concentration camp, and we also see, of course, the return of people being sent to the camps and the killings in the camps, you know, most prominently, of course, with the killing of Alexei Navalny in one of these camps. Again, you know, this is a big difference, I think, between other post-communist states and Russia. You know, again, in Ukraine or Poland after 1989, you can no longer be sent to a camp. You're sent to a prison. Now, that's something different from a labor camp or concentration camp in the Russian north. So again, we have here a continuity of a symbol or a feature of total rule, which is also analyzed by Hannah Arendt, of course, in her famous work. I can only touch this very, very briefly here. Last point, and I think this is important because Arendt talks about it a lot in her book, the idea that people under total rule lose their ability for moral judgment or to be a moral person, because they're surrounded by this propaganda and falsehood, and this also makes it difficult for them to morally judge their surroundings. And I think we can also see something similar in Putin's Russia, and maybe this is also the explanation why many Russians failed to condemn the invasion of Ukraine and the crimes there. It is this idea that, you know, the moral compass of much of society, of the people that haven't left, of course, millions have left after 2022. We can see that in Berlin. But the people who stayed, they are obviously both impacted by fear, but also by this problem that I would argue that there's a certain loss of moral judgment. So to wrap things up, I think Russia's transition from the 20th to the 21st century is of historical significance because it shows that dictatorship can return after years of partial liberalization. It is also evident that even a temporary opening to the world market and the establishment of private property do not permanently lead away from dictatorship. And I'm afraid we can also see this in the Chinese example. Russia is not even an exception, but China is very much moving in the same direction. Again, I think it becomes clear that historical research should pay greater attention to the cores of totalitarian rule and their survival in different regimes. And again, I'm talking about the state party, the army, and the secret police, and their persistence as cores of totalitarian rule. Where they have survived the 1980s and 1990s, the renaissance of total rule remains a possibility. That would be my argument. And what we can see here is a specific resilience of these structures of dictatorship, which we experience in the 21st century. Again, if you look at Ukraine, you know, it takes Ukraine 3 or 4 revolutions, depending on how you count, to get rid of these Soviet structures. They're very hard to to overcome. It was not that easy to democratize them as many people had assumed in the 1990s originally. And that's why we, can see the persistence of dictatorships in states like Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, or Cuba, because indeed this is a global phenomenon, I would argue. All right, I think my time is up. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm looking forward to the other presentations and of course also to the discussion. And again, apologies that I cannot be in Tel Aviv, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you very much, Jan. Indeed, I wish we could continue this conversation here over coffee, tea, dinner. The weather is not that great in Israel these 2 days, but still probably better than in your...
I'm sure it's not as gray as in Berlin. Berlin in November is gray and gray.
Thank you for presenting this topic and tying it so well and explaining the situation in Russia for people. We are come here in the conference from different disciplines and areas of study. So I think this really kind of presents the situation in Russia very well. And I already have a number of questions, but I'll keep them for later. Our next presenter is Professor Veljko Vujačić of Oberlin College. He too was supposed to be here and enjoy our weather and stay, but he is in the US, which means it is now slightly bit after 5 a.m. and he does this all for us. So thank you very much. We really appreciate it. Professor Vujačić is professor of sociology at Oberlin College. From 2015 to 2019, he served as a provost and professor of the European University at St. Petersburg, Russia. At the time, Putin's first attempt to close down that university, and Professor Vujačić led this move or trial to protest that. And he is a specialist in the comparative historical and political sociology of nationalism and of Russian and East European studies. He has authored many researches and review articles and 2 books. The first, The Sociology of Nationalism, 2013, and Nationalism, Myth and the State in Russia and Serbia, Antecedents of the Dissolution of the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. And his current project deals with the relations among charisma, nationalism, and tradition. So please, Professor Vujačić, he is going to, the title of the lecture is Nationalist Mobilization as a Response to Political and Institutional Decay from Milosevic to Putin. Please.
Good afternoon to you and good morning to me. It is indeed early in the morning. I'm very sorry that I'm not with you there. I understand how difficult it is now to be in Israel. And trust me, we understand also how difficult it is to be Jewish these days at American universities and colleges. Let me just say that wanted to express my solidarity, broadly speaking, with you. And regardless of all the tragedies that have occurred recently, I hope that you will be resilient, you will defend your state and nation, and you will also defend democracy. My talk is not today so much about challenges to democracy, but really more how to preempt democracy in regimes that are already not democratic. And I will argue that Milosevic was the pioneer of this kind of politics, of nationalist populism, with the goal of preempting democracy. I will now share the screen, and I have a very long PowerPoint. I will not show all of it. You're welcome to share it with the conference participants on some site, but I will just show selective slides. So let me go to that now. And I hope you can see it now. Can you see it? Okay, great. So In 2015, I published this book, Nationalism, Myth and the State in Russia and Serbia, that was already mentioned. And my goal was to explain why the outcomes in Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union were so different in 1991, namely why in Yugoslavia there was an ethnic and civil war, if you want to call it that, or a war of secession. And whereas in the Soviet Union, at least as far as the main republics were concerned, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and so on, the conflict was avoided, particularly between Russia and Ukraine. And I have to give myself a bit of credit that I anticipated already in 1996 in an article that things could change in Ukraine and warned about it. Throughout the 1990s, I worked on Russian nationalists empirically, but I decided to broaden my focus. The Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union shared important institutional features. They were both ethno-territorial federations. They both have constitutionally guaranteed rights of nations to self-determination. They both have socialist republics as territorial homelands of and for the titular nation. They had equivalent institutions in republics, party, government, and cultural institutions. They promoted local languages. They treated republics as the main units of administration and planning. And they organized transfer payments from more developed to less developed republics with the goal of equalizing development levels. Of course, this federalization was not real in the case of the Soviet Union, much more real in the case of Yugoslavia. But in both countries, we had indigenous communist revolutions, which makes Yugoslavia exceptional in the East European context. We had the politics of brotherhood and unity, or friendship of peoples. We had the idea of socialist patriotism and that the loyalty of communists to communism and the elites to communism would render nationalism irrelevant as a political force. We had a heroic self-conception of the Soviet Red Army and the Tiro's Yugoslav People's Army as carriers of revolution and anti-fascist resistance. And of course, we had political expressions of nationalism were unacceptable and forbidden by the state. I won't show too many maps, but just to remind you, this is a map that compares the administrative division of Yugoslavia with the ethnic distribution. And as you can see, the Serbs here in red, there in green, or rather in purple, there in green, were the most dispersed Yugoslav nation. Therefore, the breakup of the state would have been disadvantageous to them from a national point of view. In the Russian case, you know, Ukraine is the critical state with the largest Russian potential diaspora, and you can see the ethnic distribution here, and very quickly the use of first language, pretty much the territories that Putin wanted to contest. So I am not going to talk really about the comparability between the potential Serbian Russian diasporas, but rather just to say that the policies regarding the dominant nation were somewhat similar, but also different. Yugoslav communists were better Leninists. They condemned greater Serbian nationalism throughout communist rule. They severed the institutional connection between Serbia and Yugoslavia, and they attempted to equalize Serbia with other republics based on federalism and extending federalism to Serbia, and even to cut down Serbia to size by creating autonomous provinces within it. The result was that Serbian particularism arose in opposition to that federalism, but also contained strong pro-Yugoslav, pro-state components rather than just ethnic ones. In the Soviet Union, of course, we had something similar, except that in the Stalinist periods, things changed. The overlap between Soviet and Russian institutions made Russians not just the elder brother in the Soviet family of nations, but a kind of a Staatsvolk, a nation of state. However, Russian culture was discriminated against, right? It was the only legitimate content of Russian culture was Soviet content, right? Or Soviet approved content. Therefore, Russian particularism arose in opposition to the Soviet state. Now, I'm not going to talk about that argument, but just to say that in both cases, and I'll make it relevant for Putin's Russia, we saw a legitimacy crisis and elements of political decay. Not a very popular term, recently revived by Francis Fukuyama in his book, but really it's a term from Huntington. who stressed the importance of political order, spoke about legitimacy and effectiveness as key indicators of institutional coherence, autonomy, and talked about how elite corruption or the declining appeal of official ideology, it's more my addition, certainly no clear formulation of the public good, were all elements of political decay. Also, and I would add to this, the repeated failure of existing institutions to solve recurrent problems manifested in the rise of non-institutional or anti-institutional movements and the rising potential for political violence. Why populism and nationalism? Populism absorbs mass anger about corruption by targeting elites and sometimes minorities, offers an alternative conception of the public good, helps identify the masses with a leader against elites, creates new social and political bonds, offers a new definition of the public good, the good of the state or nation based on past glory and the prospect of future glory, and provides meaning and direction to the future. Moreover, it externalizes social conflicts and deflects attention from internal problems to external enemies. The idea is that a new potentially legitimate order will emerge around a leader who exemplifies this movement. I want to revive an old idea of Ken Jowitz from his old article on Soviet neo-traditionalism, thinking about the way in which the Soviet Union, the Soviet Party, oops, why did that happen? Can you see my presentation, or is it something else that you see now? Oh, jeez.
We can see the presentation. It's not in a presentation mode, but we do see the presentation.
Oh, you see it. Okay, something happened on my computer, and I don't know why. All right, let me continue. So Jared's idea was that the party can restore its legitimacy in two different ways. He really talked only about one in this article. That is when reform was not on the agenda. That is, instead of pursuing the path of social democracy, let's call it Gorbachev's route, the party could try to restore its legitimacy by developing an alternative combat task, elevate the army to the status of a new collective heroic agent with the idea, and this is, I think, the key formulation, of substituting the national unity of elite and citizens for the political equality between them. And I think that's exactly what Putin is doing. I will not go through the Kosovo myth or the escalating. Let me just say that in the 1980s, as many of you know, there was demographic change in Kosovo, as well as the loss of Serbia's control over its autonomous province. And, you know, not to sound like a Serbian nationalist, here's an article from the New York Times documenting some of the violence that was occurring at the time in Kosovo against the local Serbs. And of course, this is what Milosevic was able to capitalize on later on. As probably many of you know, the Kosovo myth is foundational in Serbian history, and it is a myth of heroic resistance against overwhelming odds, against great powers. And Dobrica Ćosić, who was the most important Serbian nationalist writer of the time, formulates it here, stating basically Kosovo is not just a battle from the Middle Ages, it is something that we lived through in the numerous wars of liberation, resistance to Austro-Hungary, resistance to fascism, and so on. So political decay occurred on the nationality and ethnic front, and the Kosovo issue became focal point of a larger constitutional crisis. Serbia wanted to re-centralize the federation. Slovenia and Croatia in particular were opposed to that process, using the Kosovo issue as a wedge against Serbia to a certain extent, to which Milosevic reacted with his own nationalist mobilization. Elements of political decay also had a social aspect. Economic crisis, inflation, working class strikes, failure of repression of dissidents, inability of institutions to address recurrent problems by standard means, and the challenge of dissent. What we saw then in the 1980s was the emergence of alternative narratives in Serbia, particularly the idea that Serbs were somehow cheated in the Yugoslav Federation, that their contributions to its creation and the numerous wars it fought were annulled, and that other Yugoslav nations or their elites used nationalism and separatism as tools to weaken Serbia. And the idea was that Serbs should no longer critically support Yugoslavism. In this context, Milosevic appeals both to Serbian nationalism and Yugoslav state ideology, once more resurrecting the idea of Serbian heroism. But what was also particularly clever about his speeches is that while he talks about mobilization and battles and combat and so on, he at the same time says these battles are of a new kind. We want to enter the civilization of the 21st century. We want reform. We want to enter into Europe, but we want to enter into Europe with dignity, preserving our own national interest. Now, of course, these arguments are very similar to the ones that are, for example, expounded today by Orban in Hungary, and not just today, but already for the last 10 years. Russia also, in the two already mentioned by Professor Behrends, experiences a legitimacy and effectiveness crisis in 2011-12. The modernization failure was mentioned, declining economic performance, especially in the second decade of the century, poor governance, a lot of bureaucratic Potemkin villages, which I witnessed personally, the growing personalization of power and political corruption that was exposed by Navalny most of all, the fear of democratic revolutions and long-term challenges of economic performance. Finally, of course, growing ressentiment. I don't have too much time, but let me so I'm not reading these quotes. You can look at the PowerPoint later. But according to Scheller, whose quote I really like, the most frequent cause of ressentiment on the group level lies in the discrepancy between the political, constitutional, and traditional status of a group and its actual power. You could argue that the same applies to nations, not just to individuals in a democratic or egalitarian society. Serbian nationalism, for example, was not caused by its strength, but it's actually by the relative weakness of Serbia and the Yugoslav Federation. And Russian nationalism, the discrepancy, of course, between the potential and real power in the international order. The weakening of Russia's geopolitical position can be seen as the functional equivalent of the unintended consequences of communist nationality in Yugoslavia, policy in Yugoslavia, that is cutting Russia down to size. Putin's speech on Crimea was very indicative of ressentiment. He was actually fuming in the later speeches on Ukraine, as you could see, totally losing self-control, which is a sign that the emotional aspect was very strong. Ressentiment is not just an exposure of Western hypocrisy. It is basically saying this has been always the case. They have always tried to put us down. It's not just from yesterday. It's not just the context. It's not just policy. It's not just that they did X, Y, and Z. It is a permanent feature of their attitude towards us. Putin, of course, appeals to nationalism, particularly the patriotic myth of the great victory, right, in 2020. The tone of his speeches is quite similar to those of Milosevic. Historically, we sacrificed in World War II. We were inspired by patriotism. We were inspired by the fatherland. We were able to show iron will and overcome these incredible obstacles and so on and so on. So what the Russians called drunk with victory, pobjedobesie. Of course, we also saw, like in Yugoslavia, diverging narratives in Russia and Ukraine, just as we saw in Serbia and Croatia historically, or Serbia and Slovenia. We saw, of course, the reevaluation of World War II presented as an unblemished victory rather than as a tragedy, as many Russians perceived it historically. We also see the calling into questions the borders of Ukraine as an illegitimate product of communist nationality policy. Stalin's rehabilitation was already mentioned, but it also happened on the Ukrainian side. For example, Poroshenko said in 2015, Holodomor is nothing else than a manifestation of the centuries-long hybrid war that Russia has conducted in Ukraine. Well, I don't think a historian would agree with this interpretation. Interestingly enough, a historian who reflected a lot on the unintended consequences of Soviet nationality policy, Sporluk, basically argued already in 1975 that Ukraine can survive as a civic nation or as an ethnic nation. In the ethnic case, it would have to cede probably the Donbass and possibly several other oblasts from Ukraine. So just an interesting curiosity that he mentioned it then. Just to show you that the parallels between the two cases are not accidental, I'm coming close. Alexander Solzhenitsyn in 1997 said, look what you did to Yugoslavia. You know, you're advocating European integration, but in the case of Yugoslavia, you had no problem recognizing republics. You had no problem recognizing false borders. You did not allow the Serbs to exercise self-determination, and so on and so on. And similar things you're doing in the case of Russia, Crimea, and Sevastopol. A complex question, but the U.S. State Department, choosing not to trouble itself with the history of the matter, has continued to assert authoritatively for 6 years running that both the Crimea and Sevastopol are unequivocally the property of Ukraine. End of discussion. Would it presume, so to speak, categorically to speak on the future of Northern Ireland? Putin, of course, uses a similar argument, basically arguing that the borders of Ukraine are artificial, a child of the Soviet epoch. The Bolsheviks treated the Russian people as an inexhaustible material for social experiments. They gave out territorial gifts. Russia was robbed. I mean, this is a very similar narrative as we saw in Serbia in the 1980s and early 1990s. Now, there are some similarities and contrasts with Serbia. Of course, Milosevic emerged as a genuine populist, as opposed to Putin, who has to stage mass support. Milosevic addressed the real problem, which was not of his own making. Putin, to a certain extent, produced much of the crisis in Ukraine, a self-fulfilling prophecy. Milosevic challenged the existing Yugoslav order, but Putin wishes to maintain the existing order and openly espouses conservatism. Milosevic was a dictator, but wanted the state to serve the nation rather than the nation serving the state, as in the case of Russia. And finally, he operated in the context of a unified state and waged war to enable Serbs to prevent secession or remain in one state, whereas Putin invaded Ukraine, in my view, in part, in order to strengthen what I see as the Russians' fairly weak identification with the Russian state. I'll talk about that in question and answers. I should come to an end. So, but the similarities are that both, exploited the unintended consequences of communist nationality policies, both used nationalism to deflect from internal problems, both wished to establish legitimacy and create a new order based on these nationalist appeals, both sold nationalism to the lower classes, plunged the countries into war, instrumentally exploited nationalist appeals, but also sold symbols and emotions in attempts to sacralize and mythologize the new political order. And finally, both hope to overcome political decay through nationalist appeals, mobilization, but their policies, I would argue, have produced in Serbia and will produce in Russia more political decay. Finally, what's the purpose of this war? An interesting observation about the Panslavists in the 19th century by the great historian Hans Roger essentially argues that for the Panslavists, that is people like Dostoevsky, Aksakov, and others, ideologists who wanted Russia to take part in the Balkan Wars in 1875 to 1878, they saw war as a kind of an instrument that would fuse the nation into unity, purified of class narrowness, reveal and light the new road to be followed. At least war would open a new sphere of dynamism and action that was denied at home. So if initially Putin really wanted to invade Ukraine in a few days and get over with it, his goals probably changed over time. And what he's looking at is creating a new type of society, I would argue, a sort of a military-industrial fortress society that, as Professor Behrends pointed out, is moving in the direction of a totalitarian state. Thank you. Sorry, I think I'm a few minutes overboard.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Indeed, the question of nationality comes up as a real challenge for democracies. It is used and abused, and we'll probably have a discussion of that later. But now we're moving to the other side of the globe with Dr. Yoav Frumer, going to speak about what is going on in the United States now. And his talk is who gets to be an American? What's at stake in the 2024 US presidential elections? And Dr. Yoav Frumer is the head of the Center for the Study of the United States and senior faculty member in the Department of English and American Studies at Tel Aviv University. His research focuses on 20th century American culture, history, and politics, and the interactions between them. He specializes in the study of the American left, conservatism, and US-Israel elections, and is currently writing a book about the relationship of American labor unions to Israel during the Cold War. So, Yoav, please.
Do I need the microphone, or can you hear me? Yeah, okay. כן, זה בסדר? אני זז פשוט. אני זז, תפס לי הגב, אני עמוד ככה. So thank you. All right. Okay, so thank you for the organizers for inviting me. Thank you for my fellow panelists. I hope in the future we could meet in person, but did I do that? I didn't do that. But I want to talk a bit about the election, right? And really, this is just some initial thoughts and really a work in progress from the last few weeks, because I think a lot of us had a lot of soul searching since the elections a couple of weeks ago, and to try to understand what happened, and certainly I know I did. And one of the things that that led me maybe to formulate this talk the way I did is really this a surprise. Oh my God, I can't believe Donald Trump won again, right? And America's authoritarian, and America is going to be a dictatorship, and all these pessimistic they might come true, right? But all these pessimistic assessments of what lies ahead. And I think when I was thinking about how do we approach this, I thought that the standard way, right, this is the Washington Post, the morning after, right, the standard way of thinking about it is still what's happening to American democracy, right? Right here, this is a great book, by the way. This is comparative. I know maybe some people might know this, right? It's both political scientists at Harvard, who try to comparatively document how and why democracies die, certainly looking at Europe and at Latin America, and at more and more at the United States since 2016 and Trump. And I think there's something about this discourse which is problematic. And this is what I want to talk about today, because I think this discourse takes something for granted, right? It makes certain assumptions, and it takes for granted that democracy, that liberal democracy, at least in the United States, is almost deterministic. Right, in the sense that the, right, I'll just wait till we have this back up. All right, so again, it comes back to a certain expectation, almost deterministic, right, about America as inevitably heading towards liberal democracy, and that's our starting point, right? And that's why I think we're so surprised when this happens, right? When this happens, right, in 2021, and certainly when Trump gets elected the first time in 2016, and certainly now when he really gets overwhelmingly elected and does have a certain mandate at least, right, winning also the popular vote. And again, and we're surprised by it, and we can't understand it, right? And I think that's a problem, because that means our assumptions are flawed. So when I was coming back to this point, here's again the Washington Post, I'm just using it as an example, but this is the discourse. Certainly if you're, in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the New Yorker, CNN, et cetera, right, that democracy is under threat, because the assumption is that liberal democracy is that's the standard bearer of American politics. And I think we need to ask ourselves something different. And that's what I'm going to try to do very briefly in this short talk. And it's asking a different question, right? It's not asking what's happening to American democracy. Why is American democracy failing? Which is the question everyone's been asking in the last few years. I think we have to go back and ask ourselves, why did liberal democracy succeed in the United States in the first place? Because once we do that, I think we already were thinking very differently about this whole story, and then we could understand that there was nothing predetermined in all of these, and these are wonderful achievements. I think these are the great achievements of liberal democracy in the 20th century, right? Of course, I'm distinguishing liberal democracy from democracy. This forum here knows that a very important difference, right? And really since the 1930s, beginning with a certain form of economic equality and justice that begins to a certain extent after the New Deal, right, in the late 30s. So that's why these are just a few kind of, this is a collage of some of those great achievements of liberal democracy. So the New Deal, right, kind of in the 30s with Roosevelt, the Great Society and the War on Poverty under LBJ, right, who replaces Kennedy in the 60s. The integration of African Americans and women here both in the Supreme Court, and of course Obama's victory in 2008, and Clinton, who thought she was right. This was right before she loses in 2016. So here's a rally where she thought she was going to become the first president of a female president of the United States. So I think I'm going back here to these moments, and I'm asking, maybe partially, purposely, provocatively, the question of, was this an exception? Is liberal democracy, rather than something predetermined to succeed, maybe something which is very contingent, almost anomalous in the way that it succeeded over the 20th century? That's what I want to propose to you now. I think, right, this is, I think, something we need to consider, to some extent at least, and it's the idea that all of this is incorrect in a way, right? That rather than thinking about especially American history, this is already global, right? But this is an expansion of America's kind of almost utopian democratic vision for the world at the end of the Cold War. But rethinking this idea of democracy as destiny, certainly in the international sphere, which my fellow panelists discussed earlier on today. But also when we think about American history, the development of liberal democracy in America, I think we might need to start thinking about it as a convergence of a variety of reactions, right? Many of them contingent, primarily as responses to sweeping geopolitical, economic, and technological change. So that's just this is what I want to kind of impress upon you in this short, I don't know, 10 minutes I have left or something like that. And just to try to think about liberal democracy in America, again, not as American history leading itself towards that moment, which is still how we tend to romanticize it, I think, at least in public discourse, but also some scholars, but rather as this, right, as something much more contingent, and primarily as a set of responses to geopolitical, technological, and economic moments of crisis and transformation. Because once we do that, we could look at Trump and the resurgence of the American right in its present form, right? The American right has a long history. Some of it is quite glorious, but this is a very bad example, of course, of some of its more negative consequences. And so I want to just look at some of those moments, and I want to just begin with technology and economic crisis, right? Of course, the Great Depression, it forces, for a variety of reasons, obviously, it forces a recalculation, a recalibration of America's economic vision or economic policies, but also in terms of technology, right? And here I'm looking at two moments, especially in the 20s and the 30s and the 40s of the 20th century, right? Two things happen here. The first is a technological revolution. Here I'm relying a lot on Robert Gordon, the macroeconomist at Northwestern. This was a very important book, The Rise and Fall of American Growth, and it looks at technological change as an incentive of social and political change. And in this sense, right, Robert Gordon's whole theory is that the second industrial revolution, the transformation of science and then of the American economy in the early 20th century, especially around the automobile industry, the emerging aerospace industry, radio and telecommunications industry, as these moments that create not only a technological shift, but an economic shift that then facilitates what's going to become the middle class, right? The expansion of socioeconomic equality, kind of the best America's ever had in that terms, in terms of the most equal moment in American history. So one is thinking about a technological change, right, as a product of the second industrial revolution in the turn of the century, in the early 20th century. And the second is economic change, right? The fact that the Great Depression, the collapse of a certain economic model fails, and it forces a recalibration of economic philosophy. Here, of course, is John Maynard Keynes, right, in the bottom left. And the historian Richard Hofstadter famously called the New Deal, right, the set of policies by the FDR, right, as a chaos of experimentation. And the history certainly suggests that, right, that there was nothing inherent or essential about embracing Keynes. It was after a couple of years where Hoover, right, who was before Roosevelt, he tried a few things. They didn't really work or not work enough in terms of government involvement in stimulating growth and public works and different fiscal policies. But kind of embracing Keynesian, Keynesian economic philosophy, and especially the beginning of an American welfare state and government intervention and some kind of stimulation and regulation of the American economy as a reaction, right, to this moment of crisis, and of course the failure of previous laissez-faire philosophies. So this is just this one example, I think, of how a response to, in this moment, both technological transformation and global economic depression leads America to embrace a certain socioeconomic vision that it otherwise would not necessarily have embraced. And this vision is vital because that's going to contribute, right? This is, of course, the Norman Rockwell idealization of the middle class, right? The freedom from want. It's taken from FDR's speech about the four freedoms, right? And here he's glorifying prosperity and abundance and that material security, which I think, and I'll come back to this, but this is such a central part of the story that we take for granted. It's the material prosperity without which liberal democracy cannot survive. And in that sense, maybe this is what we're seeing, right, in the last 20 years, the rapid and continuous decline of material security for middle-class Americans, really the evaporation of parts of the American middle class, is very naturally also, right, inducing the collapse of American democracy because, and again, we take this for granted in the West and even in Israel, but how thin how thin the line of material security is, and once that's breached, democracy just falls through. And I think one of the reasons why we're going to have all these achievements in the second half, really, of the 20th century in America is because we can have this, right? Because of that material security that's secured through the New Deal and through these new economic policies and new technologies, which is also very important, the technological aspect, right? This is, by the way, this is just income inequality in the US, and this is, we always like to show this, but you could see that, right, from the late 1930s to Reagan, really, to the 80s, it's the most equal time in American society. That's why we also mythologize the middle class in these 4 decades, because it is the era of the middle class, right? The so-called American dream and so forth, right? So we have technology and reaction to depression. The second, and I think maybe the most important vehicle for liberal democracy in American history is the federal government. And maybe that's why critics of liberal democracy hate the federal government so much, right? That certainly has to do with it. But we also have to remember, the federal government is a coincidence, at least the federal government, the way we know it today, to have developed in the United States, without these moments of crisis. First of all, the Great Depression, and then, of course, the Second World War and the Cold War. The federal government, as we know it today, and this is what Trump might be looking to, right, to change drastically with his so-called government, Office of Efficiency, right? Elon Musk is going to head the Department of Efficiency, right? It's very Orwellian, right, in that sense. But the federal government is born out of these moments, right? And if you didn't have, I think, these contingencies, there would have been no federal government, at least the way it has developed in the second half of the 20th century. And here I'm just, I think, most of these are familiar to you, right? On the left, you have FDR with the alphabet soups, right? The name of all federal, bureaucracy and these new government offices, right? Public Works Administration, Works Progress Administration, Agriculture Adjustment Agency, right? So all these are the new agencies from the federal government that really Roosevelt creates in order to fight the Depression in the 30s. They also set in place the federal government that in World War II and then especially the Cold War is going to really expand and become almost this Leviathan, or what critics on the right, people like William Buckley Jr. and American conservatives are going to call the American Leviathan state. And partly, right, here is the Pentagon, of course, built during World War II. The CIA, right, created in the National Security Act of 1947. This is, of course, the nuclear suitcase, right? This is a real thing. And that's also part of the national security bureaucracy that's created at the early years of the Cold War. And all of these create this huge federal government with unprecedented powers that did not exist before and might not have existed had it not been for these geopolitical challenges of the Second World War and the Cold War. And this matters, right? This matters because the federal government in American history is the primary guarantor, at least in the modern American history, the primary guarantor, the primary vehicle, I think, of liberal democracy. These are just a few examples, right? Just first of all, foremost, in terms of socioeconomic equality for white people, at the beginning at least, right? This is the GI Bill. Let's use one example, right? The GI Bill, which is really one of the most important legislations, I think, in American history. You have 8 million soldiers returning home from World War II. What do you do with them? You need to give them jobs, you need to give them homes, right? So one of the things Congress does is pass the GI Bill, which among its many virtues, paying for college education, it also subsidizes homes and mortgages, and it allows the growth of the suburbs, right? This is an ad for Levittown in Long Island. That's kind of the first myth, right? The first kind of suburb. Again, this is all subsidized by the federal government very heavily. So the federal government here is a vehicle for middle class, for social mobility, for things which are going to prove so essential for the establishment of liberal democracy in the 50s and 60s and 70s, right? So this is just this example of the federal government as a vehicle for social mobility and welfare. And the second example, which again, I'm sure many people here are familiar with, is the fact that the federal government, and again, as distinguished from Congress, which is much more problematic, is the fact that the federal government, the executive branch, is a leading proponent and guarantor of civil rights for African Americans and for women by late 60s, early 70s, of course, right? I call this Cold War rights, but of course these are examples that probably many people here know, right? The desegregation of the military by Truman, right? This is something that as president that the federal government does, despite the fact that there's much opposition in Congress to this, especially by Southern representatives, right? So this is kind of 1948. Eisenhower sends in the 82nd Airborne Division to Little Rock in 1957, right, in order to enforce Brown v. Board and the desegregation of the public education system, right? So federal government, LBJ. This is the one example where Congress actually does something good, right here. This is the Civil Rights Act, but again, this is not necessarily, I think, a natural product of American democracy. It's a product of, first of all, Johnson being a very strong president who's able to kind of force much of the opposition in the South to accept the Civil Rights Bill and the Voting Rights Act of 1964 and 1965. And again, he himself is from the South, right? He knows these people, he has a personal relationships with them, that's how he's able to push this through, mostly, by the way, with Republicans, but today we don't think of that. But he, you know, the civil rights, the only civil rights acts that are passed in the 60s are passed because a third of the Republican Party votes for it, and many of the Democrats don't, right? Because, you know, the Southern Democrats are obviously against this. So this is, so kind of the whole point here, the whole example here that I'm giving is really how the federal government is able to push through civil rights for African Americans, later on also for women and LGBTQ, especially with executive orders, right? Affirmative action is first and foremost achieved through executive orders by Kennedy in '61 and several by Johnson, not through legislation. This matters because legislation is the democratic process, which they cannot get it across. And we tend to forget this because there is a lot of opposition in the South to many of these bills, right? And that's why the federal government, through executive order of the president, has to push these through, right? So these are just a couple examples of the right of depression, technological change, economic crisis, war, World War II, the Cold War. I'll just say one final thing about the Cold War. I forgot to say, it was kind of central to this point. All of these are in the context of the Cold War. We know that Truman makes this decision and Eisenhower makes this decision because of what's happening in terms of the Soviets, in terms of how the Soviets are using this as propaganda, right, in the ideologic Cold War, right, especially in the global South, right? They're showing segregation, they're showing kind of African-American kids get beaten up in Birmingham, Alabama on the news, in Africa and the Middle East, in Asia and Vietnam, right? We know this is occupying Eisenhower and even Truman before that, who's only at the beginning of the Cold War. So also the Cold War kind of as being an incentive for equal, you know, for liberal democracy in the United States. How much time do I have? Yeah, all right, so I'll wrap it up. All right, so these are kind of, I think, the big moments. There's also something about elites. I won't have time to get into it, but also you have a different form of elites. A new class of elites emerges in the 30s, 40s, and 50s who are associated with liberalism. And this is very different because the elites before that, I mean, you always had cultural elites, of course, certainly abolitionism in the 19th century, but the elites were primarily economic elites before that, and the emergence of a class of liberal elites who are very supportive of civil rights and women's rights, I think that matters a lot. And they have I think the public stature that very few, well, I don't think any elites today, certainly intellectuals, have the public stature that someone like Trilling had in the 40s, or even Christopher Lasch in the 70s, where they're invited to the White House. And by the way, if you notice, all of the books are mass paperback. That means they sold hundreds of thousands, even millions of copies, and that's something I think which is unfathomable today to think about an intellectual, a literary critic, right, like Trilling, like kind of writing a book that sells 2 million copies. All right, so anyway, I think I'll just wrap it up. All of these things they come apart, right? You know this, they begin to dissolve for a variety of reasons, right? The economic model in Keynesian philosophy of the New Deal begins to come apart in the 70s because of all of these, a variety of structural changes to the global economy. Right here are some of them: post-industrialization, automation, of course the rise of competition in Southeast Asia and in Western Europe, in the 70s and the 80s, right? So the end of the American welfare state. The Reagan Revolution, right? This, of course, the election of Reagan, on one hand, who declares war on labor unions and begins to dismantle the federal government and cut taxes, but also the end of the Cold War. We don't think about that as a bad thing for American liberal democracy. I think it was, unfortunately, right? The unintended consequence of the end of the Cold War is that one thing, the last adhesive, I think, that holds together American society, that allows all of these positive changes, it comes apart, right? And it's not a coincidence that by the 1990s, you have the resurgence of what's going to become the MAGA, right? The MAGA movement is born really with Pat Buchanan in the early 90s and Ross Perot. And these are, I think, also directly influenced by the end of the Cold War that kind of unleashes all of these forces. And just a final thought about the elites. The elites, the liberal elites, the elites associated with the federal government, they lose their legitimacy because they deserve to lose their legitimacy. Unfortunately, the war in Iraq, first and foremost, right? Hurricane Katrina, the failure of the American bureaucracy, and of course the 2008 financial crisis, that delegitimized the role of the elites and the experts and the federal government in the eyes of many Americans in a way that certainly, I think, opens the door to this. All right, and I'll conclude with that note.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our audience for being patient with us despite the delay. Thank you to our speakers connected from afar in different time zones. And I hope we manage to to continue the discussion sometime in the future in person. Anyway, thank you very much. And we'll conclude. We'll meet at 3 p.m. after lunch. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jan, and thank you, Veljko. Thank you.